Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Olympic National Park, Washington State, October 2014. The phone call came at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday, just as Christopher Brennan was updating trail closure notices in the ranger station. The woman's voice carried that particular tremor he'd learned to recognize over 20 years in search and rescue. Not panic yet, but standing right at its edge, looking down. "My daughter hasn't answered her phone in 36 hours, Mrs. Mitchell said. "Harper. She's doing research for her graduate thesis, anthropology. She was studying the Quinault legends around Lake Quinault, and her last text said something about voices in the trees." Christopher's pen stopped moving. The fluorescent lights above hummed their monotonous note. Outside, the perpetual mist of the Olympic Peninsula pressed against the windows like something trying to see in. "Voices," he repeated, keeping his tone professionally neutral. "I know how that sounds," Mrs. Mitchell continued, words rushing together now. "But Harper isn't. She's sensible. She wouldn't just go off-grid without telling me. And that last message, it was strange. She said she'd found something the elders had refused to talk about. Something about Thauxia." Christopher's hand went to his neck unconsciously, fingers finding the small scar beneath his collar. 8 years. 8 years since the Hoh River incident, and he still couldn't hear certain words without his body responding before his mind caught up. "Ma'am, I need you to send me Harper's last known location, her vehicle description, and that text message," he said, already pulling out the SAR protocols binder. "I'm going to initiate a search immediately." After he hung up, Christopher sat in the empty station for a full minute, staring at the topographical map of the Quinault River watershed on the wall. The green contour lines twisted like a maze, elevation markers climbing toward the interior wilderness where the old growth stood in cathedral silence, where the mist never quite burned off, even at noon, where, if you listened carefully enough, the forest sometimes whispered back. His supervisor, Martinez, wouldn't be back until tomorrow. Christopher could wait, file the proper paperwork, assemble a team by morning. That was protocol. That was sensible. But he thought about Harper Mitchell, 23 years old, curious enough to go looking for stories that the Quinault elders kept locked behind their teeth. He thought about 36 hours in the Olympic backcountry as October darkness came earlier each day. And he thought about 8 years ago, when he'd been the one stumbling out of the forest 3 days late, unable to explain the gaps in his memory or why his equipment had been found scattered across 2 miles of trail. Christopher pulled his personal pack from the storage locker. His hands moved with practiced efficiency. Water purification tablets, emergency beacon, first aid kit, waterproof matches, thermal blanket, headlamp, spare batteries, his Gerber multi-tool, paracord, the orange trauma kit he'd replaced twice in 20 years but never actually needed. The SAR radio went on his belt, his personal Garmin GPS, more reliable than his phone in the backcountry, clipped to his chest pocket. The duty log waited on his desk. He wrote the time, his name, initiating preliminary search for Harper Mitchell, last known vicinity, Lake Quinault Northwest Trails, and signed it. Not quite by the book, but documented enough that Martinez wouldn't have his head. Before he left, Christopher opened the bottom drawer of his desk and withdrew the item he'd kept there for 8 years, wrapped in a plastic evidence bag that had never made it to any official report. The small carved figure, no bigger than his thumb, smooth river stone shaped into something almost human but not quite. He'd found it clutched in his own hand when he'd regained consciousness that day in 2006, with no memory of picking it up. He put it in his pocket, just in case. Harper Mitchell's silver Subaru Outback sat alone in the trailhead parking lot, surrounded by towering Sitka spruce that dripped with condensation. Christopher arrived at 6:15 p.m., with maybe 90 minutes of usable light remaining. The October sky already held that particular quality of dimness that meant the dark would come fast when it came. He approached the vehicle systematically, circling it twice before touching anything. Washington plates, a university parking permit on the windshield, coexist bumper sticker, next to one for the American Anthropological Association. The doors were locked. Through the window he could see a sleeping bag in the back, a camp stove, a red backpack, and his stomach tightened. Her phone, sitting in the center console. No one left their phone behind. Not in 2014. Not deliberately. Christopher pulled out his own phone and took photos of the vehicle, the license plate, the parking lot from multiple angles. One bar of signal, flickering. He texted dispatch with Harper's plate number and location, waited for the message to send, then pocketed the device. From here on, the radio would be more reliable. The trailhead sign read, Quinault Ridge Trail, 6.2 miles to Three Lakes Junction. Below it, smaller. Difficulty, moderate. Elevation gain, 2,400 feet. Caution, trail may be muddy and overgrown beyond mile 4. Christopher knew this trail, had walked it maybe 30 times over the years. It wound up through the transition zone between lowland temperate rainforest and the higher alpine zones, following an old indigenous route that predated European contact. The Quinault people had traveled it for centuries, before white settlers arrived, before the park boundaries were drawn, before any of this land had been discovered by anyone who bothered writing it down. He stepped onto the trail. The forest closed around him immediately, the way it always did here. Olympic National Park contained some of the last true old-growth temperate rainforest in the continental United States, trees that had been ancient when Lewis and Clark were still planning their expedition. The canopy rose hundreds of feet overhead, dense enough that even midday felt like dusk. Everything wore a coat of moss. The massive tree trunks, the fallen logs, the rocks, even the sword ferns that filled every gap. The moss-swallowed sound turned the forest into a green cathedral where footsteps fell muffled and distant. Christopher switched on his headlamp, even though ambient light remained. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating water droplets suspended in the air like the forest was slowly dissolving into vapor. He hiked fast, eyes scanning the trail for any sign of disturbance. Harper had come through here sometime in the last 2 days. The trail showed recent boot prints in the mud, but the rain had been constant. Impossible to tell if they were hers or belonged to some other hiker. At the half-mile mark, he found a granola bar wrapper caught in a salal bush. Generic brand, could have been anyone's. He bagged it anyway. The trail climbed steadily. Christopher's breathing found its rhythm, that meditative cadence that came from decades of hiking these mountains. His body knew this work, the way his weight should shift over roots, how to read the trail surface for the firmest footing, when to push and when to conserve energy. But his mind stayed alert, cataloging every detail. At mile 2, he found the first thing that made him stop. A small cairn sat beside the trail, 5 smooth stones stacked in a careful balance. Nothing unusual about that. Hikers built cairns constantly, little monuments to their passage, but this one stood on a flat stretch where the trail was perfectly visible. Cairns served as navigation markers in confusing terrain. This one marked nothing. Christopher crouched beside it, examining the stones without touching them. River rocks, worn smooth, graduated in size. The kind of careful construction that took time and attention. He stood and continued hiking, but his hand drifted to his pocket, fingers finding the carved figure he'd carried for 8 years. The temperature dropped as he climbed. His breath began to show in the headlamp beam. The mist thickened into proper fog, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. Sound changed, too, not louder or softer, but flattened, directions becoming uncertain. His boots on the trail, the drip of condensation from branches, his own breathing, all seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. At mile 3, he found Harper's bandana tied to a branch. It hung from a western hemlock sapling right at trail height, impossible to miss. Bright purple fabric, deliberate placement. Christopher pulled it down carefully, noting that the knot was tight, intentional. A trail marker, then. Harper telling anyone who followed that she'd come this way. But the trail only went one direction. Why mark it? He keyed his radio. Dispatch, this is Brennan, over. Static answered, thick and prolonged. He tried again. adjusting the frequency. More static, punctuated by brief crackles that might have been speech or might have been interference. Christopher checked his GPS. The device showed his location accurately, the trail line tracking his movement, but the elevation reading flickered between numbers. 1,147 feet, then 19923, then 1734. He tapped the screen. The numbers steadied at 1,868 feet, which seemed approximately correct for mile 3. He tied the bandana to his pack and kept moving. The fog grew thicker. His headlamp beam barely penetrated 15 feet now, just revealed the trail immediately ahead and turned everything beyond into indistinct gray shapes. The massive trees became pillars disappearing into whiteness. The forest had always felt like a separate world, but now it felt like the only world. Everything else erased. At mile 4, the maintained trail ended. The sign had warned him. Overgrown beyond mile 4. What it hadn't mentioned was that overgrown meant the trail essentially vanished. The clear dirt path he'd been following disintegrated into a maze of fallen logs, ferns, and moss-covered stones. He could see traces of a route, slight depressions in the vegetation, the occasional worn spot on a log where boots had scraped away moss, but nothing definitive. Christopher paused, sweeping his headlamp across the tangle of forest. The GPS showed the trail continuing northeast, climbing toward the ridge that would eventually reach Three Lakes Junction. But Harper had gone somewhere. The bandana proved she'd made it to at least mile 3. Had she continued on the official route, or diverted? He was about to key his radio again when he saw it. Another cairn, this one built on a nurse log 10 feet off the trail. And beyond it, barely visible through the fog, another one. A trail within the trail. Christopher's pulse quickened. He approached the first cairn, examining the stones. Same smooth river rock, same careful construction. He looked ahead and spotted a third cairn, maybe 30 feet deeper into the forest. Then a fourth, just barely visible at the edge of his light. Harper had marked a route. Not the maintained trail, something else. The carved figure in his pocket seemed to grow heavier. Christopher took a breath, made a decision. He pulled out his personal GPS and marked a waypoint. Left main trail following cairn 6:48 p.m. Then he stepped off the official route and into the old growth. The forest changed character immediately. On the maintained trail, there'd been at least the pretense of human presence. The cut pathway, the occasional blaze mark on trees, the sense that rangers passed through regularly. Here, that thin veneer of civilization vanished. The spaces between the massive trees stretched into darkness. Fallen logs lay in geometric chaos, some as wide as Christopher was tall, their root systems rearing up like frozen waves of earth and wood. The moss grew thicker, cushioning his footsteps into absolute silence. He moved carefully, stopping at each cairn to locate the next one before proceeding. The trail wound between the giants, never straight, following some logic he couldn't quite discern. Sometimes the cairns sat on fallen logs, sometimes on boulders half buried in moss, once on a peculiar flat stone that looked almost deliberately placed. At the 7th cairn, Christopher found Harper's first journal entry. The plastic-wrapped pages had been tucked beneath the top stone, protected from the rain. He unfolded them carefully, his headlamp revealing dense handwriting in blue ink. October 14th, 2014. Day 3. I found it. The elders wouldn't talk about it directly, but Mrs. Kalipa hinted when I asked about the restricted areas, places where the tribe asks hikers to stay away, even though they're technically within park boundaries. She called this place Thamna, where the voices sleep. Said her grandmother warned that curiosity about certain things could wake what should stay dormant. But here's what fascinates me. Every culture has guardian spirit traditions, but the Kino conception of Thauksia is different. It's not benevolent or malevolent. It's both, depending on intention. Protect the sacred by removing threats. But removing here has specific meaning, not death, but transformation. Taking what makes you you, and redistributing it into the forest. I know how that sounds. I'm a scientist, but the consistency across accounts, the way people describe feeling less, after encounters, the documented cases of people found physically unharmed but fundamentally changed. The cairns started appearing 2 days ago. Not by me. Someone else marked this route probably decades ago. The stones have that settled look, moss growing in the crevices, following them tomorrow. Christopher read the entry twice, then carefully refolded the pages and put them in his pack. His hand went again to his neck, to the scar. 8 years ago, he'd staggered out of the Ho River backcountry, missing 3 days of memory. The search report had concluded acute disorientation, likely due to dehydration and hypothermia. But Christopher remembered fragments, voices that sounded like his daughter calling for help, following them deeper and deeper into the forest until the trail disappeared. And the feeling, persistent even now, that he'd left something behind in those trees. Something he couldn't name but could feel the absence of, like a tooth your tongue keeps finding the gap where it used to be. He continued following the cairns. The 8th one sat at the base of a Sitka spruce so massive its root system created a small cave in the earth. The 9th perched on a boulder covered in what looked like pictographs, faded red ochre marks that might have been ancient or might have been tricks of lichen and shadow. The 10th marked a small clearing where the fog thinned briefly, and Christopher could see actual stars through a gap in the canopy. He checked his GPS. According to the device, he'd traveled 0.7 miles from where he'd left the main trail, but that didn't feel right. It had seemed like more. Time had that elastic quality in the deep forest, especially in fog and darkness, but his internal sense of distance usually stayed reliable. The GPS elevation reading flickered again. 2,234 feet, then 2,007, then 2,189. Christopher frowned, tapping the device. Satellite signal could be spotty under heavy canopy, but he'd never seen it fluctuate this wildly. He checked the time. 7:43 p.m. That seemed wrong too. He'd left his truck at 6:15, spent maybe 10 minutes examining Harper's car, then approximately 90 minutes hiking. Should be closer to 8 hours. He looked at his watch. It read 7:43. Both devices agreed, but the discrepancy nagged at him. That feeling when your body knows something your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. At the 11th cairn, Christopher found something that made his breath catch. His own equipment bag, the one that had been missing for 8 years. It sat at the base of a western red cedar, the orange fabric faded but unmistakable. The bag he'd carried the day he'd gone into the Ho River forest and come out changed. The bag that search and rescue had never recovered, despite combing the area for a week. Christopher approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. The bag was real, solid, water-stained but intact. He knelt and unzipped it with fingers that had gone numb despite his gloves. Inside, his old Motorola radio, dead for years. A water bottle still half full, the water somehow clear. Energy bars with expiration dates from 2006, his backup flashlight, and, wrapped in a waterproof stuff sack, a small notebook. He didn't remember keeping a notebook. Christopher opened it with mounting dread. The first dozen pages were blank, then in handwriting that was his but somehow wasn't, the letters too careful, the spacing too precise, a single entry. It took my name. I can't remember my name. I can see my driver's license, Christopher, but that's just a word. It doesn't mean me anymore. I don't know who I am without my name. I don't know how to leave. The voices keep asking me to stay. They sound like Sarah. But Sarah is 7 years old and I can't remember. Why can't I remember? The entry ended there. The remaining pages were blank except for the last one, which contained a single sentence in that same too careful handwriting. If you're reading this, you came back. Don't follow the voices. Christopher's hands shook. He didn't remember writing this. Couldn't remember writing this. His memories of those 3 missing days were just fog and fragments. Voices calling his daughter's name. The desperate need to find her even though part of him knew she was safe at home with his ex-wife in Seattle, nowhere near this forest. He stood abruptly, the notebook falling from his hands. The headlamp beam swung wild across the trees, revealing nothing but moss and fog, and the massive trunks disappearing into darkness. And then he heard it. "Dad?" His daughter's voice. Sarah's voice, except Sarah was 15 now, her voice deeper, starting to carry that teenage disdain. This voice belonged to Sarah at 7 years old, the way she used to call for him when she'd had a nightmare. "Dad, where are you? I'm scared." Christopher's body reacted before his mind could stop it, taking 2 steps toward the sound. Then he froze, breath coming hard, pulse hammering in his ears. Sarah was in Seattle. Sarah was fine. Sarah was... "Dad, please, it's so dark here. I can't find the trail." The voice came from deeper in the forest beyond where his headlamp reached. Not distant, but not close. That middle distance where sound got uncertain in the fog. Christopher forced himself to stand completely still, to breathe, to think. Harper Mitchell was out here somewhere. Harper, who was real, who was actually lost, who needed help. Not Sarah. Sarah was safe. "Dad?" The voice had changed slightly. Still Sarah, but with a questioning tone, like she couldn't quite understand why he wasn't coming. Christopher pulled out Harper's journal entry and read it again, focusing on one sentence. "Taking what makes you you, and redistributing it into the forest." His name. Whatever had happened 8 years ago, whatever he'd encountered in the Hoh River forest, it had taken something fundamental. His sense of self, and he'd spent 8 years feeling that absence, that gap, learning to function with a piece of himself missing. "I know what you are," Christopher said quietly, speaking to the darkness. "And I'm not following." Silence answered. Then, after a long moment, Sarah's voice came again, but different now. Flatter, less human. "You came back." "I'm looking for Harper Mitchell," Christopher said, keeping his voice steady. "That's all. I'm not here for anything else." "She came looking for us. Curious, asking questions." The voice shifted, no longer quite Sarah's. Something underneath it now, like multiple speakers slightly out of sync. "We showed her. She wanted to understand. Now she does." "Where is she?" "Where you were. Where you'll be again." "I'm not..." Christopher stopped himself. Arguing with it felt wrong, like acknowledging something he didn't want to acknowledge. He changed tactics. "Is she alive?" A sound came from the darkness. It might have been laughter, but it might have been wind through branches. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing closer. "Alive," the voice said. "Alive." Such a specific word. She breathes. Her heart beats. Are those the only things that matter? Christopher's hand went to his radio. Still only static. He tried his cell phone. No signal at all now. The GPS showed his location, but the elevation numbers had stopped making sense. 3,847 feet, which was impossible. He hadn't climbed nearly that much. Movement caught his eye. About 30 feet away, partially obscured by fog and tree trunks, a figure stood watching him. Christopher's headlamp beam found it. A person, definitely human-shaped, but something wrong about the proportions. Too tall or too thin, or both. The light didn't quite seem to touch it properly, sliding off like oil on water. "Harper," he called out. The figure didn't respond. Just stood there, motionless in a way that humans never were. No shifting weight, no unconscious adjustments, no breathing. Statue still. Christopher took a step toward it. The figure moved, sudden and wrong, not walking but relocating, now 10 feet further away, behind a different tree. Still watching. He tried his radio again. "Dispatch, this is Brennan. I've located a possible sighting. Quinault backcountry, approximately." He looked at his GPS and stopped. The coordinates didn't make sense. The device showed him miles from where he should be, in an area that according to the map was just blank space between trail systems. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Static, but this time with something underneath it. Words, maybe. He adjusted the frequency dial carefully. Not alone. A fragment of voice, male, unfamiliar. Following, something. "Who is this?" Christopher said into the radio. "Identify yourself." "Christopher." The voice cut in and out. "Turn back, it's not..." Then his own voice came through the radio, the transmission crackling but clear. "I'm looking for Harper Mitchell, that's all. I'm not here for anything else." Christopher froze. Those were his words from 30 seconds ago. His exact words, his voice but coming through the radio. He hadn't transmitted them. His finger hadn't even been on the push-to-talk button. He turned the radio off and clipped it back to his belt, pulled out the carved stone figure from his pocket and held it in his palm. In the headlamp light, he could see details he'd never noticed before. The figure had no face, just a smooth oval where features should be. And its hands were pressed against where its chest would be, as if holding something inside that wanted to get out. "You need to understand something," Christopher said to the darkness, to whatever was listening. "I'm not a curious graduate student. I'm not someone who came looking for you. I'm a search and rescue ranger, and my job is to bring Harper Mitchell home. That's it. I don't care about your legends or your territory or what you think you're protecting. Just tell me where she is." The figure had disappeared. The forest was silent except for the constant drip of condensation. Christopher waited, counting his heartbeats, trying to keep his breathing steady. Then the cairns started appearing. One by one, maybe 15 feet apart, they materialized out of the fog ahead of him. Not suddenly, more like his perception catching up to something that had been there all along. A trail of them extending deeper into the forest, each one glowing slightly in his headlamp beam as if the stones themselves held luminescence. An invitation, or a trap. Christopher thought about his daughter, safe in Seattle. About his ex-wife Marie, who'd never quite understood why he'd stayed in the Forest Service after the incident. Why he kept coming back to these mountains. About the notebook he'd just found, written in his own hand, that he couldn't remember writing. And he thought about Harper Mitchell, 23 years old, who'd come here asking questions because she wanted to understand something larger than herself, who'd left markers for anyone who might follow, who deserved someone willing to follow. He checked his supplies, water, food, emergency equipment, all present. The carved figure went back in his pocket. The notebook from his old pack he left behind. Whatever he'd written 8 years ago didn't matter anymore. What mattered was moving forward. Christopher marked his GPS position one more time, knowing the coordinates were probably meaningless now. Then he started following the new cairns, deeper into the forest, toward whatever waited at their end. The fog became a living thing. It didn't just obscure vision, it restructured space. Trees that had been to Christopher's left appeared on his right. The ground that had been climbing began descending, then climbing again without him having gone downhill. His compass spun lazily, never settling on north. The GPS screen flickered and went dark, then revived, showing his location somewhere in the middle of Lake Quinault, which was impossible because he could feel solid earth under his boots. Time unraveled worse. His watch read 8:15, then 7:52, then 9:03. He stopped checking after that. The cairns continued their trail, steady markers in the madness. At least those stayed consistent. Christopher clung to that, each pile of stones a confirmation that this was a path, that someone had traveled it before, that there was a destination rather than just endless wandering. At what might have been the 23rd cairn, or might have been the 100th, he found Harper's second journal entry. October 15th, day 4, I think. The cairns don't mark distance, they mark moments of choice. Every time I reach one, I feel the pull to turn back, and every time I choose to continue, something changes. Not the forest, me. I'm becoming less opaque. That's the only way I can describe it, like I'm slowly being diluted. Mrs. Kalapa was right. This isn't about harm, it's about belonging. The forest wants me to be part of it, but you can't be part of something and remain separate. The mathematics are elegant, actually. Every system tends toward equilibrium. You can't introduce a foreign element without that element either transforming the system or being transformed by it. I chose transformation. That's the anthropologist's curse, wanting to understand from the inside. But I'm leaving these notes because I think I was wrong about one thing. I thought I was choosing. I'm starting to suspect the choice was made for me the moment I asked the first question. Thausia doesn't force, it simply reveals the inevitable. Whoever finds this, tell my mom I wasn't scared. Tell her I found what I was looking for. Christopher folded the pages carefully, his hands steadier than they should be. A strange calm had settled over him somewhere in the last however long it had been. Terror required a stable sense of self, and his had been loosening its grip since the moment he'd found his old equipment bag. He understood now what had happened 8 years ago. Why he'd come out of the Ho River forest feeling like he'd lost something essential. Why mirrors sometimes showed him a stranger. Why his own name occasionally sounded like nonsense syllables. Why Sarah at 15 felt simultaneously like his daughter and like a person he'd never met. Thauxia, the voice in the moss, the guardian of the deep places, didn't kill. It absorbed. It took the edges that made you separate from everything else and smoothed them down until you became part of the ecosystem. Another element in the forest's chemistry, and it had been doing so for centuries, maybe longer. All those missing persons cases, all those hikers who'd walked into the Olympic backcountry and never walked out, they were still here in a sense, just not as themselves anymore. The fog parted briefly, and Christopher saw them. People. Dozens of people, standing among the trees like they'd grown there, which perhaps they had. Some were translucent, barely visible. Others looked almost solid but wrong in subtle ways. Clothing from different eras, skin with a greenish tint like moss, eyes that reflected his headlamp beam like an animal's. They watched him pass. None of them moved, none of them spoke, but he knew them. Not personally, but categorically. These were the lost ones, the disappeared. The people who'd pushed too far into the wilderness and found something that pushed back by pulling them in. One of them looked familiar. Christopher stopped, his headlamp settling on a figure standing beside a massive cedar. Male, maybe early 30s, wearing gear from the 1990s. He had Christopher's nose, Christopher's build, Christopher's hairline. "Dad?" Christopher whispered. His father had disappeared hiking the Olympics in 1993. Christopher had been 18. The search had lasted 3 weeks. They'd found nothing, not even the body. The figure that might have been his father tilted its head, studying Christopher with eyes that were the wrong color. Green, where they should have been brown. But the expression was right. That slight quirk of the mouth that meant he was thinking through a problem. That faraway look that meant he was 3 steps ahead in the conversation. "You came far," the figure said. Not quite his father's voice. Flatter, but the rhythm was correct. The way he'd always paused between words like he was reading them from some internal script. "You're not real," Christopher said, but without conviction. "Real enough to warn you. Turn back. What you're moving toward, you can't return from. The balance tips I tipped. Couldn't find my way back to being just me. The forest was too loud. Harper Mitchell chose this, just as I did, just as you're doing now." The figure gestured at the trail of cairns extending into the fog. "Every step is a choice, even the one you think you're not making." Christopher's throat tightened. "I have to try." The figure that might have been his father smiled, sad and knowing and already lost. "That's what I told myself, that I had to see what was beyond the next ridge. That understanding was worth the cost. But understanding doesn't live in your head, Christopher. Understanding is giving up the border between you and everything else, and you can't save someone by becoming what they became. Then what do I do? You decide what you're willing to lose. That's the only real choice any of us ever had." The figure stepped backward and simply ceased to be distinct from the tree behind it. Christopher blinked and it was gone. Or had never been there. Or had been there but was now part of the moss and bark and the slow, dark growth of the ancient cedar. Christopher touched his neck scar, closed his eyes, breathed. Then he continued following the cairns. The forest opened into a clearing that shouldn't exist. Perfect circle, maybe 50 feet across, absolutely level ground. In the center, a pool of water so still it looked solid, reflecting stars that Christopher couldn't see through the fog overhead. Around the perimeter, 7 trees grew in geometrically precise positions, all western red cedars, all approximately the same size, all with their lowest branches at exactly the same height. And kneeling at the water's edge, staring into the pool, Harper Mitchell. She looked unchanged. Same dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, same practical hiking clothes, same backpack beside her. She didn't turn when Christopher entered the clearing. Didn't seem to notice his presence at all. "Harper," Christopher called out. No response. She continued staring into the pool, motionless. Christopher approached carefully, watching for... what? A trap? But the clearing felt neutral, absent of menace. Just still, profoundly, unnaturally still. He knelt beside Harper, following her gaze into the water. The reflection showed stars, yes, but also shapes moving beneath the surface. Or maybe moving within the reflection itself. Impossible to tell. Patterns that almost made sense, that felt on the verge of revealing meaning. "Harper," he said again, quieter. "Your mother sent me. She's worried. You haven't called." Harper's lips moved, forming words without sound. Christopher leaned closer. "Everything connects." The whisper was barely audible. No boundaries, never were. We drew them, but they were always fiction. "Harper, look at me." Slowly, with visible effort, Harper turned her head. Her eyes met Christopher's, and for a moment they were perfectly clear. Young, intelligent, aware, scared. "I can't find the way out," she said, her voice stronger now. "I can see it. I can see every step I took to get here. But when I try to reverse them, I just end up back at this pool. It's like the forest learned me, learned how I think, how I move, and now it knows me too well to let me go." "I can lead you out," Christopher said. Harper laughed, sharp and bitter. "You followed my cairns. You came exactly where it wanted you, don't you understand? Every person who comes looking becomes part of the pattern. That's how it protects itself, not by attacking, but by absorbing, by making you want to stay." "I don't want to stay." "Not yet." Harper looked back at the pool. "But you will. Just like I was starting to. It shows you things. Connections you never noticed. Patterns in everything. The way water flows, the way light moves through leaves, the way your thoughts are just electrical impulses that aren't really different from the electrical impulses in a tree responding to storm damage. It breaks down the categories. Human, forest, life, matter. They're all just energy arranged differently." Christopher understood. God help him, he understood. Because he'd felt it 8 years ago, standing in some other clearing in the Ho River backcountry. The sense of boundaries dissolving, the seductive logic that insisted separation was the illusion and connection was truth. "That's not freedom," Christopher said. "That's disappearing. Or it's finally becoming real, finally being honest about what we are." Harper's hands trailed in the water. Ripples spread across the surface, distorting the star reflections. "Mrs. Kalapa tried to warn me. She said the elders teach that Thausia doesn't take, it reveals. And what it reveals is that we were never separate to begin with. We just pretended we were." "Harper." Christopher made his voice firm, authoritative. The voice he'd used for 20 years guiding lost hikers back to safety. "Stand up, we're leaving." "I can't." "You can. You choose to stand, you choose to walk, you choose to follow me. It's that simple." "It's not." Harper's voice cracked. "Christopher, it is Christopher, right? That's what my notes said. Christopher Brennan. You went missing in 2006. 3 days. They found you disoriented, dehydrated. No memory of what happened." "Yes. But you remember now, don't you? You remember standing somewhere like this, seeing the connections, feeling yourself dissolve." Christopher didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Harper continued, quieter. "You escaped. Somehow. But you left something behind. I can see it in you. There's a gap. Like part of you is still here, in the forest, and you've spent 8 years walking around incomplete. Then I'm evidence that escape is possible. Are you? Harper met his eyes again. Or are you evidence that escape is just a longer route to the same destination? You came back, Christopher. Everyone who touches this comes back. It's in you now, spreading, growing, like moss colonizing a stone. Slow but inevitable. Christopher pulled out the carved figure from his pocket and set it on the ground between them. The small stone shape, featureless face, hands pressed to its chest. I found this 8 years ago. I've carried it ever since, even though I couldn't remember where it came from. It was a reminder, I think, a promise. A promise to what? To not forget that I made it out. To not let the forest convince me that losing myself was the same as finding truth. Christopher stood, his knees protesting. You're right. Part of me is still here. Maybe it always will be. But the part that's still me, the part that walks and talks and works and loves my daughter, that part chose to leave. And I'm choosing for both of us now. He reached down and grabbed Harper's arm. She didn't resist, but she didn't help either. Dead weight. Christopher pulled harder, leveraging his body to haul her upright. Come on. Stand. Harper's legs buckled. Christopher caught her, his arm around her waist, her weight against his shoulder. She felt lighter than she should, as if she'd already begun the process of becoming less substantial. I don't know the way, Harper whispered. I do. It was a lie. Christopher had no idea how to leave this clearing. The cairns had led here but gave no indication of where to go next. The fog remained impenetrable. His GPS was useless. His compass spun meaninglessly. Every direction looked identical. But he'd learned something 8 years ago that he'd only half remembered until now. Thauxia was intelligent, but it operated on its own logic. It revealed what was already true. It absorbed what chose to be absorbed. But it couldn't force, couldn't compel, could only invite and wait, which meant refusal had power. Christopher looked at the pool, at the star reflections and the moving patterns beneath. He thought about his father, standing among the trees, about the dozens of other figures he'd passed, all of them choosing to stay or unable to choose to leave. It amounted to the same thing. I refuse, he said clearly. For both of us. We're leaving. The clearing remained still. The pool reflected its impossible stars. Nothing changed. Christopher chose a direction, northeast, or what his body insisted was northeast even though his compass said otherwise, and started walking, Harper Mitchell leaning against him, her feet dragging through the moss. They'd made perhaps 10 steps when the voices began. All of them. Every missing person, every lost hiker, every curious soul that had touched this place and stayed. They spoke simultaneously, a chorus of whispers that filled the forest. His father's voice, Sarah's voice, voices he didn't recognize, voices that might have been his own. They spoke different words, but with single meaning. Stay, understand, connect, dissolve, become, stay, stay, stay. Christopher kept walking. Harper's weight increased, as if the forest itself was adding gravity to her, trying to root her to this place. His legs burned. His breath came hard, but he focused on moving forward, on the simple mechanical process of one foot in front of the other. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They overlapped until individual words became meaningless, just a wall of sound that vibrated in his chest cavity, that seemed to shake loose the boundaries between his thoughts and the world outside. Christopher closed his eyes. It helped. Without vision, he had only touch and sound, and the proprioceptive sense of his own body moving through space. He let those guide him, trusting muscle memory and instinct over the sensory chaos that was trying to disorient him. One step, another step. Harper stumbling beside him. Another step. His hand touched bark, rough, deeply furrowed. Sitka spruce. Real, solid. He opened his eyes. The fog had thinned slightly. He could see 20 feet now, maybe 30. And there, barely visible, a small pile of stones. A cairn. One of Harper's original markers, the ones she'd built on her way in. The voices cut off abruptly, mid-syllable. The silence that followed was almost worse. complete and absolute, like someone had just muted the entire forest. Christopher didn't stop moving. He fixed his eyes on the cairn, used it as a navigation point, pulled Harper toward it, reached it, found the next one, kept going. They walked for hours or minutes or days. Time had lost all coherence, but the cairns continued their trail backward, and Christopher followed them with religious focus, not letting himself think about anything except the next pile of stones. Harper began to walk more steadily. Her weight normalized. At one cairn, she stood without his support, breathing hard but present. At the next, she spoke. "Thank you." Christopher just nodded and kept moving. The fog gradually, almost grudgingly, began to lift. Christopher started recognizing landmarks. That particular fallen log, that distinctive root formation. They were back on the maintained trail, or something close to it. The forest still felt wrong, too quiet, watching, but the oppressive weight had lessened. His GPS blinked back to life, showing coordinates that finally made sense. His watch read 3:47 a.m. Impossible. That would mean they'd been in the forest for more than 9 hours. But the darkness held that particular quality of pre-dawn, so maybe it was true. They walked in silence until the trail widened, until the trees grew farther apart, until Christopher could see the parking lot lights through the fog, like distant stars. Harper's Subaru sat exactly where it had been, Christopher's truck beside it. The world was normal, mundane, blessedly ordinary. They stopped at the trailhead, both of them swaying with exhaustion. Christopher pulled out his radio and tried it one more time. It crackled to life immediately. "Brennan, this is dispatch. Do you copy? Christopher, if you can hear this, dispatch, this is Brennan." His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I have Harper Mitchell. We're at the Quinault Ridge trailhead. We're safe. We need medical evaluation, but no immediate injuries." The relief in the dispatcher's voice was palpable. "Copy that. Medics en route. ETA 15 minutes. Christopher, where the hell have you been? We've had teams searching since midnight." Christopher looked at Harper. She looked back at him. They'd made it out, but they'd left pieces of themselves in those woods, and they both knew it. The forest had them now, in small ways. Not absorbed, but marked. Changed. "Long story," Christopher said into the radio. "I'll debrief when we get back." He helped Harper to her car, where she collapsed against the hood. She pulled out her phone, the one she'd left behind, and stared at it like she'd forgotten how it worked. "What do I tell my mother?" Harper asked. Christopher thought about the carved figure, still in his pocket, about his father among the trees, about the gap inside himself that had been there for 8 years and would probably never fully close. "Tell her the truth," he said. "You got lost. Someone found you. You came home." "That's not the whole truth." "No, but it's the only part that matters." Harper nodded slowly. She was crying now, quiet tears that cut tracks through the dirt on her face. "I saw my future in that pool. I saw myself staying, becoming part of the pattern. And part of me wanted it. That's what scares me. Part of me still wants it." "I know," Christopher said. Because he did know. He'd felt that pull 8 years ago, and he felt it still, every time he walked these trails. The seductive promise of dissolution, of finally letting go of the heavy burden of being a separate self. "Does it get easier?" Harper asked. Christopher thought about his daughter Sarah, about the way he sometimes couldn't quite connect her face to the feeling of loving her, about mornings when he looked in the mirror and had to consciously remind himself that the reflection was him, about the persistent sense that he was living in borrowed time, that the forest would eventually call in its debt. "No," he said honestly, "but you learn to live with it. And the people who love you, they'll anchor you. Keep you remembering why being yourself matters even when part of you has forgotten." The sound of sirens cut through the pre-dawn darkness. Medics, search and rescue teams, the whole apparatus of society coming to pull them back into the world of human boundaries and separate selves. Christopher pulled the carved figure from his pocket and looked at it one last time. The featureless face, the hands pressed to the chest protecting something inside, or holding something back. He set it on the ground beside the trailhead sign. A marker, a warning, a promise that some debts remain unpaid, some connections can't be fully severed, and some forests never truly let go. Harper watched him do it. She understood. They both did, in ways they could never explain to anyone else. They'd gone into the deep places and come back, but they hadn't come back alone. They'd brought the forest with them, quiet, patient, waiting. The medics arrived with blankets and questions. Harper's mother, who'd driven through the night when she'd heard her daughter was found, held her and wept. Martinez showed up and gave Christopher that look, the one that meant they'd be having a long conversation about protocol and unauthorized searches and going solo into the backcountry. But all of that was later. For now, Christopher stood at the edge of the parking lot, watching dawn slowly burn away the fog. The forest emerged from the retreating mist. Trees and moss and ferns, ordinary and beautiful and entirely natural. Except for the voice, so quiet he almost missed it, barely more than a whisper on the morning breeze. Until next time. Christopher closed his eyes, counted to 10, and opened them again. The forest was just a forest. Trees were just trees. The voice was just wind. He told himself that. He would keep telling himself that. And maybe eventually, it would be true. He got in his truck and drove toward the rising sun, leaving the Olympic National Park behind. But he could feel it watching him go, patient as stone, waiting for the day when he'd stop remembering why he'd chosen to leave. And on that day, the forest would be ready. The end. Thank you for reading. If you enjoyed this supernatural horror story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened to Christopher during those 3 missing days in 2006? Did Thauxia let Harper go, or is she slowly being pulled back? Share your theories in the comments below. I read everyone and love seeing different interpretations. And if you'd like to see more stories like this, consider following for more atmospheric horror and mystery narratives. What elements worked best for you? The psychological horror, the ambiguous nature of the entity, the emotional stakes? Your feedback helps me craft even better stories. Olympic National Park, Washington, October 2014. 6 hours into the search, and Chris Hayes could no longer trust his own ears. The Hoh rainforest pressed in from all sides, a living cathedral of Sitka spruce and western hemlock that turned afternoon light into underwater gloom. Moss hung from every branch in thick curtains, muffling sound until the forest felt like the inside of someone's mouth. Chris's boots squelched through mud that released the smell of rotten copper every time he lifted his foot. "Lauren Mitchell!" His voice came out hoarse. He'd been calling for so long that his throat felt stripped raw. "Lauren, if you can hear me, stay where you are, make noise!" Static crackled from the radio on his belt. "Hayes, this is base, any sign?" Chris unclipped the radio, thumbing the transmitter. His hands looked strange to him, too pale. Fingers trembling slightly from cold or exhaustion or something else. "Negative. I'm at mile marker 7 on the Hoh River Trail. Haven't found tracks since the mudslide crossing." "Copy that. Parents just arrived. They want to talk to whoever's closest to where she was last seen." Chris closed his eyes. Of course they did. "Tell them I'm doing everything I can." "They know, Chris. Everyone knows you're thorough." Thorough. That was the word people used now. Not reliable or experienced. Thorough. As if he needed to prove something. As if 3 years ago in North Cascades hadn't happened. He pushed the memory down and kept walking. The trail here barely deserved the name. Rainfall in the Ho averaged 12 feet annually, turning the forest floor into a sponge of decaying matter and new growth locked in perpetual war. Nurse logs, fallen giants from centuries past, stretched across his path, their bark long since rotted away, their bodies serving as foundations for entire ecosystems. Ferns sprouted from their backs. Saplings took root in their decay. Everything consumed everything else. Chris checked his GPS. The device's blue dot blinked steadily. "You are here," but the satellite signal kept flickering. Too much canopy, too much moisture in the air. He had a compass and paper maps in his pack, old-school backups he'd learned to trust more than technology. Lauren Mitchell had been with 15 other students and 2 teachers on a supervised day hike. They'd stopped for lunch at the big spruce tree, a massive specimen marked on tourist maps, and when the lead teacher did a head count afterward, Lauren was gone. No one had seen her wander off. No one had heard anything unusual. That was 4 hours before anyone called it in. 4 hours of the school staff searching on their own, convinced she'd just stepped behind a tree, gotten briefly disoriented. By the time Chris got the call, the girl had been missing for nearly 6 hours. Now it was closing in on 10. He paused at a fork in the trail, studying the ground. The soil was too churned by boot prints to read clearly. The school group had trampled through here. But something caught his eye. A partial impression near the base of a hemlock, filled with brown water. Too small for a teacher's boot. He knelt, ignoring the mud soaking through his uniform pants. "Lauren?" He said it quietly, almost to himself. The forest swallowed his voice. Then, faint, impossibly distant, he heard it. "Help!" Chris's head snapped up. The word had come from somewhere off-trail, deeper into the forest where no marked path existed. His pulse kicked up, hammering against his ribs. He grabbed his radio. "Base, I've got possible audio contact." Female voice calling for help, bearing approximately northwest from my position. "Copy. Proceed with caution and maintain radio contact every 15 minutes. Chris clicked off and pushed into the undergrowth. The moment he left the trail, the forest changed. Without the path as anchor, the space between trees seemed to shift, reconfiguring itself. Moss-covered branches hung at face level. Devil's Club, Washington's cruelest plant, blocked easy passage with spines that could drive through clothing. Chris moved carefully, marking his path with orange tape tied to branches every 30 feet. "Lauren, keep making noise so I can find you." Silence. Not even birdsong. That was wrong. The rainforest should be alive with varied thrushes and winter wrens. But the deeper he went, the quieter everything became. His radio crackled. "Hayes. Status?" "Still searching. I thought I heard Chris." He stopped. That had been his name, not from the radio, from somewhere ahead. "Lauren?" His voice came out smaller than intended. "Chris, please." It sounded like her. It sounded exactly like what a terrified 17-year-old lost in the woods would sound like. But something about it felt wrong. The timbre too perfect, the fear too precisely calibrated. He'd heard this before. 3 years ago in the North Cascades, he'd spent 2 days tracking a missing hiker named Marcus Donnelly. He'd followed Marcus's voice through the mountains, always just out of reach, always calling his name with that same desperate edge. When they finally found Marcus, he'd been dead for 48 hours at the bottom of a ravine. His body lay frozen, mouth open, as if mid-shout. The voice Chris had been following came from a completely different direction. He'd never told anyone the full truth about those 2 days. The official report said he'd suffered from exhaustion and auditory hallucinations caused by altitude and stress. The unofficial whispers among other rangers suggested something else. That Chris Hayes had cracked, that whatever happened up in those mountains had broken something fundamental in him. They transferred him to Olympic, lower elevation, less isolation, a place to prove he could still do the job. And now he was hearing voices again. "Chris, it hurts." His hands were shaking. He pulled out his compass, checked his bearing, made another orange tape marker. The rational part of his brain cataloged his symptoms. Elevated heart rate, hyperventilation, Cold sweat despite the temperature. Panic response. Trauma trigger. He knew what this was, but he also knew Lauren Mitchell was out here somewhere. 17 years old, maybe injured, definitely terrified. He kept moving. The forest grew denser. Fallen logs formed barriers that forced him to climb over or crawl under. His uniform snagged on bark, collected moss in wet clumps. Time felt strange here. He'd check his watch and see only 5 minutes had passed when it felt like 30. The light was failing, filtering through the canopy in greenish shafts that made everything look submerged. So cold, Chris. So cold. Closer now. Definitely closer. He pushed through a curtain of hanging moss and found himself in a small clearing. In the center stood a nurse log so large it must have fallen centuries ago. Its body had hollowed out, creating a cave-like opening big enough to walk into. And there, at the entrance, was Lauren Mitchell's backpack. Chris's breath caught. He approached slowly, pulling a latex glove from his belt pouch. The backpack was purple with school patches sewn onto it. Lincoln High, Olympia. The zipper hung open. He looked inside. Granola bars, a water bottle half empty, a phone with a cracked screen and no signal. "Lauren!" He shouted it now, abandoning caution. "Lauren, your backpack is here. If you can hear me, make noise." Nothing. He clicked his radio. "Base, I've found the subject's backpack. Coordinates." He rattled off the GPS numbers. "I'm investigating the immediate area. Backup is 40 minutes out, Chris. Don't do anything." "Chris..." The voice came from inside the hollow log. Every instinct screamed at him to wait for backup. Protocol was clear. Never enter a confined space alone. Never pursue without support. But 40 minutes might be too long. If Lauren was injured, hypothermic, trapped inside, he pulled out his flashlight and approached the opening. The hollow extended back into darkness, the wood walls slick with moisture and fungus. The smell hit him immediately, not decay, but something older. Mineral and wet, like stone that had never seen sun. His flashlight beam caught movement deeper inside, shadows that seemed to pull back from the light rather than be revealed by it. "Lauren?" His voice echoed strangely, as if the space inside was much larger than it should be. "I'm scared." He stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. His breath came out in visible clouds. The interior walls pressed close. He had to hunch to avoid hitting his head. Water dripped from somewhere ahead, each drop hitting with a sound like a tongue clicking. His flashlight flickered. "No," he muttered, slapping it against his palm. The beam steadied, but weaker now. He moved deeper. The hollow curved, disorienting him. He should be able to see the entrance behind him, but when he looked back, there was only more tunnel. His orange tape markers were nowhere in sight. Panic touched his throat. This was wrong. This was... "Chris." The voice came from directly behind him. He spun. His flashlight beam caught something in the darkness, a shape that might have been a person or might have been shadow. Then it was gone. "Who's there?" His voice cracked. Laughter, soft and wet, like someone trying to laugh through water. "You know who I am. You've always known." The voice wasn't Lauren's anymore. It shifted between registers, male and female, young and old, his voice and others. Each word came from a different direction. "You heard me in the mountains. You followed me then. You're following me now." Chris backed away, his shoulder hitting the tunnel wall. The wood felt too soft, too much like flesh. His radio crackled, harsh static that resolved into screaming, then silence. "This isn't real," he said. The words came out desperate. "You're not real." "Does it matter?" The flashlight died. Complete darkness. The kind that pressed against eyeballs, making them invent shapes and movement where none existed. Chris fumbled for his backup light, fingers numb with cold. Found it. Clicked it on. Lauren Mitchell stood 3 feet in front of him. She looked wrong. Her skin was too pale, lips blue-tinged. Her clothes hung wet and heavy. But worst were her eyes. They held no pupil, no iris, just uniform darkness that reflected his flashlight beam like oil. "You can't save me," she said. "You couldn't save Marcus either." "You're not Lauren." Chris forced the words out. "Lauren is alive. She's out here somewhere, and I'm going to find her." The thing wearing Lauren's face tilted its head. "Are you sure? Are you sure you're even awake right now, Chris? Maybe you never left North Cascades. Maybe you're still up in those mountains, frozen in the snow, dreaming all of this." His hand found the radio. He pressed transmit, heard only static. "No one can hear you. No one could hear Marcus either." He called and called, but his voice belonged to me. Chris's training warred with his terror. Observe, document, stay rational. He focused on details. The thing's feet didn't quite touch the ground. Water dripped from its hair but never pooled. Its chest didn't move with breath. Not real, not physical. "What do you want?" he asked. The smile was too wide. "To feed. Your fear is delicious, Chris. Your doubt, your guilt. I've been feasting on it since the mountains. You brought me here. Every time you questioned yourself, every nightmare, every time someone called you thorough, and you heard broken, you fed me." It stepped closer. The temperature dropped further. "Lauren will die out here, just like Marcus, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you could have done more, if you weren't so damaged, if you were still the ranger you used to be." "No." Chris straightened, though his legs shook. "I'm done listening to you." He closed his eyes, breathed, in through nose, out through mouth. Ground himself in physical sensation, the mud on his boots, the weight of his pack, the ache in his throat from shouting. Real things. Tangible things. When he opened his eyes, the thing was closer, almost touching him. "You can't will me away, Chris. I'm part of you now." "Maybe," he said. "But Lauren isn't." He pushed past it, through it, and the sensation was like walking through spiderwebs. Cold, clingy. Then he was moving, running, one hand on the tunnel wall as guide. His backup light showed the way. Forward, always forward, no looking back. Behind him, voices shouted his name. Marcus's voice, his ex-wife's, his father's, all the people he'd disappointed, all the ways he'd failed. The thing was trying to stop him, trying to drag him back into doubt. He ran anyway. Light appeared ahead, real light, afternoon sun filtering through moss. Chris burst out of the hollow log and fell to his knees in mud. His radio crackled. "IS! Chris Hayes, respond!" He grabbed it with shaking hands. "I'm here. I'm here." "Thank God." "What happened?" "You went dark for 30 minutes. 30 minutes, it had felt like hours. I found..." He looked back at the hollow log, just a log, wood and fungus and normal forest decay. "I found Lauren's backpack, but she's not here. We've got dogs incoming. They'll pick up her scent from the pack. Just hold position." Chris sat back against a tree, breathing hard. His hand still trembled. His mind felt scraped raw. But he wasn't broken. He'd walked through it, whatever it was, and come out the other side. The search dogs arrived 20 minutes later, followed by a team of 6 rangers. They took scent from Lauren's backpack and immediately picked up a trail Chris had missed, not northwest, but northeast, toward the Hoh River itself. They found her an hour later, sheltered under an overhang, soaked and hypothermic but alive. She'd slipped on moss, twisted her ankle badly, and crawled to the only shelter she could find. She kept saying she'd called for help, but no one came. No one except Chris, who'd been led in the completely wrong direction. The rescue made the evening news. Lauren was treated for exposure and a hairline fracture in her ankle. Her parents wept with gratitude. Chris's supervisor clapped him on the back and said he'd done good work, thorough work. Chris accepted the praise with a nod. He didn't mention what he'd experienced in the hollow log. He didn't mention the voices or the cold or the thing wearing Lauren's face. But that night, lying in bed in his cabin on the edge of the park, he thought about what it had said. "You brought me here." Maybe he had. Maybe trauma worked like that. It carved out spaces inside you, and sometimes things moved into those spaces. Real or not, They fed on fear and doubt and guilt until you couldn't tell the difference between memory and experience, between rational explanation and something older. He'd spent 3 years trying to prove he wasn't broken, but maybe that was the wrong goal. Maybe he was broken. Maybe North Cascades had broken him, and maybe that was okay. The cracks let light in. The cracks also let other things in. The question wasn't whether he was damaged. The question was whether he could still do the job anyway. His phone buzzed. Text message from his supervisor. Another hiker reported overdue in North Cascades. They want someone who knows the area. Interested? Chris stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed, yes. He'd go back to the mountains. He'd face whatever was there, real or imagined, external or internal. Because Lauren Mitchell was alive. Because sometimes doing the job meant walking through the fear instead of around it. Because the voices might never stop, but he could choose whether to listen. Outside his window, the Hoh rainforest stretched dark and ancient under starless sky. Somewhere in those trees, things older than names watched and waited and fed on fear. Chris turned off his phone and went to sleep. He dreamed of moss and voices, but he didn't run. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of what Chris really encountered in the hollow log? Supernatural entity or manifestation of trauma? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. Olympic National Park, Washington State. October 2014. The radio crackled against David Mercer's hip, a burst of static that resolved into Anderson's voice. Mercer, you copy? We're pulling back to base camp. Lights going in 40 minutes. David pressed the transmit button, his thumb leaving a smear of mud across the plastic. Negative. I'm continuing search pattern Delta 7. David. Anderson's tone shifted, the careful modulation of someone talking to a spooked animal. You've been out there 6 hours. Your GPS shows you've covered 12 miles of trail and another 4 off route. Come back. We'll resume at first light with fresh teams. The forest pressed close on all sides, western hemlock and Sitka spruce rising 200 feet into the canopy, their trunks thick with moss that glowed phosphorescent in the dimming light. The Hoh River growled somewhere to his left, swollen with October rain, though he couldn't see it through the undergrowth. Visibility was maybe 30 yards before the mist swallowed everything. Hannah Reeves has been missing 14 hours, David said. Statistical survival window closes at 72. I'm not wasting 12 of those sleeping. Silence on the other end. Then, it's not about the statistics, is it? David didn't answer. He clicked off the radio and kept walking. The trail, if you could still call it that, had degraded into a suggestion, a slightly clearer path through the ferns and devil's club that tore at his uniform pants. His left boot had developed a leak somewhere around mile 8, and his sock squelched with each step. The GPS unit on his belt showed his position as a blinking blue dot against the topographic map. Elevation 872 feet, 1.3 miles northeast of the last confirmed sighting location. Hannah's backpack had been found at mile marker 5. Tour's contents scattered across the trail. Her phone was dead, crushed, the screen spiderwebbed, but the last outgoing audio message still recoverable. Her mother had played it for him that morning, her hands shaking as she held out her own phone. Mom, there's someone on the trail. I thought I was alone, but I keep hearing. It sounds like you. It sounds exactly like you, calling my name, but you're in Tacoma. You can't be here. Mom, I'm scared. The voice knows things. It knows about the argument we had. It's saying the exact words you said, but the mouth. Mom, when I see where the voice is coming from, the mouth isn't moving right. Please call me back. Please. Static. Then nothing. David had seen the mother's face crumple, had watched her fold into herself like paper catching fire. He'd said the right things, used the phrases from the training manual. We're doing everything we can and let's stay positive. And the Olympic wilderness is vast, but we know these trails. What he didn't say, I've heard this before. I've stood in almost this exact spot and listened to almost these exact words, and 8 years ago I failed, and Sarah Chen is still missing, and sometimes I hear her voice too. The mist thickened as he pushed deeper into the forest. Temperature was dropping. His breath emerged in visible puffs now, maybe 48 degrees and falling. The dampness penetrated his ranger jacket, settled into his bones. His handheld radio hissed with periodic bursts of static, though no voices came through anymore. Either he was too deep in the forest or Anderson had given up trying to call him back. A sound emerged from somewhere ahead. A voice, female, young. "Help me." David froze. His right hand dropped to the mag light clipped to his belt, though he didn't turn it on yet. The forest had gone quiet around the voice. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Even the river seemed to have hushed. "Hello?" he called. "Hannah? Hannah Reeves? Please, I don't know where I am." The voice came from the northeast, off trail. David consulted his GPS, marked his current position, and began pushing through the undergrowth. Salmonberry bushes caught at his jacket. A spider web stretched across his face, invisible until it was too late, and he clawed it away. "Keep talking," he shouted. "I'm coming to you. What do you see around you?" "Trees, it's all trees. I can't find the trail." 50 yards into the underbrush, his boot caught on something. He looked down and saw a blue sneaker. Women's size 7, the laces still tied. He keyed his radio. "Anderson, I've found evidence. Hannah's shoe approximately 400 yards northeast of..." Static roared back at him, so loud he had to yank the radio away from his ear. When it subsided, there was something underneath it. A whisper that might have been words, but probably wasn't. "Hannah?" he called again. No response. The forest had swallowed the voice entirely. David crouched beside the shoe. The ground around it was disturbed, but not dramatically. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. Just the shoe, placed almost carefully on a bed of fallen needles. He pulled an evidence bag from his pack and sealed the shoe inside, tagged it, marked the GPS coordinates. As he stood, something moved in his peripheral vision. A figure, pale and quick, darting between two massive spruce trunks about 20 yards ahead. Too fast to see clearly, but the silhouette was human-sized, human-shaped. "Hannah!" He ran. The forest opened into a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, carpeted in moss that glowed in the failing light. In the center stood a western red cedar, its trunk 12 feet wide, its bark hanging in long strips. The tree was old, 500 years, maybe more. David had seen it on topographic maps marked as landmark cedar, used as a waypoint by hikers since the 1960s. The figure stood on the far side of the tree, barely visible, female, wearing what might have been a purple jacket like Hannah's. But the proportions were wrong somehow. The limbs too long, or the torso too short, the perspective skewed, as if he were seeing her through warped glass. "Hannah, stay where you are. I'm Ranger David Mercer. I'm here to help you." The figure tilted its head. Even in the dim light, David could see that the movement was wrong. The angle too extreme, like a bird examining prey. Then it spoke, and the voice was his ex-wife's voice. "David, why didn't you find me? Why did you let me disappear?" His breath stopped. "Sarah." Sarah Chen's voice. Exact pitch, exact inflection, the same accent she'd had from growing up in Vancouver. But Sarah had been gone 8 years, and this couldn't be her. This wasn't possible. "You're not Sarah," he said, and his voice came out steady, which surprised him. "You promised you'd find me." The figure stepped around the tree, and now David could see it more clearly in the fading light. It wore Sarah's face, or a close approximation. The features slightly smeared like a photograph taken through water. "You searched for 3 days, and then you gave up. You went home. You let them declare me dead." "We searched for 2 weeks," David said. "I personally covered over 100 miles of trail. We used dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging. But you didn't find me." The thing smiled and its mouth opened too wide, split at the corners. "Because you weren't listening, I was calling to you the whole time." David's right hand moved slowly to his belt, fingers closing around the handle of his knife. Not that a knife would help against whatever this was, but the solid weight of it provided an anchor to reality. "Where's Hannah Reeves?" he asked. The Sarah thing laughed, a sound like wind through hollow trees. "She's listening, just like you're about to listen." Then the forest erupted with voices. His mother dead 15 years. "David, sweetheart, come home." His father, "Son, I need your help. I'm lost." Anderson, his supervisor. "Mercer, I'm hurt. I'm off the trail. You need to find me." And underneath them all, hundreds of other voices, a cacophony of the lost and desperate, all calling for help, all perfectly mimicked, all fundamentally wrong. David dropped to his knees and pressed his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside, resonating in his skull, each one plucking at a different memory, a different fear, a different point of guilt. Through the noise, he heard his own voice, not external, but the rational part of his mind that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan and 15 years in search and rescue. "It's not real. It feeds on fear. Don't listen. Find Hannah." He forced his eyes open. The Sarah thing had moved closer, was now only 10 feet away. Up close, he could see that it wasn't wearing a body so much as suggesting one, a collection of shadows and mist that had learned the shape of human. Where its eyes should have been, there was only hollow darkness. "What are you?" David asked. "I'm what happens when people get lost," it said. And now it spoke with Hannah's voice, young and terrified. "I'm the voice that leads them deeper. I'm the hope that keeps them walking until they can't walk anymore. I'm the last thing they hear before they stop hearing anything at all." David's fingers found the emergency flare in his jacket pocket, the one every ranger carried for situations like this, though the training manual had never covered situations quite like this. He pulled the flare free, tore the ignition strip. The flare ignited with a magnesium-white burst that turned the clearing into noon. The thing recoiled, its form fragmenting in the sudden light. And in that moment, David saw what was behind it. A hollow in the base of the massive cedar, maybe 4 feet wide, and inside that hollow was movement. He ran. The hollow was deeper than it looked, extending back into the tree's heart. David thrust the flare inside and saw Hannah Reeves curled at the back, unconscious but breathing, her face pale and her lips faintly blue. Around her feet lay bones, dozens of them, picked clean, scattered across the cedar's root system. Behind him, the voices rose to a shriek. The temperature plummeted, his breath emerging in clouds so thick he could barely see. The flare began to dim, its chemical reaction struggling against something that wasn't cold, but was the absence of heat, the absence of energy, the absence of everything. David grabbed Hannah under her arms and dragged her toward the opening. She was dead weight, maybe 120 pounds, and his back screamed as he hauled her over the lip of the hollow. The flare guttered and died. In the sudden darkness, something touched the back of his neck. Not physical contact, but the sensation of contact, ice that burned. The voices collapsed into a single voice, his own voice speaking words he'd thought to himself 1,000 times over the past 8 years. "You should have saved her. You should have looked harder. You should have known. It's your fault. It's always been your fault." "Maybe," David said aloud. He pulled Hannah free of the hollow, felt her head loll against his shoulder. But not this time. The thing screamed, not with a voice, but with a pressure in the air, a frequency that made David's vision blur and his nose start bleeding. He fumbled for another flare with fingers gone numb, couldn't find one, realized he'd only carried 2 and used them both. Then his radio erupted with actual voices, crackling with distance but human, blessedly human. "Anyone on this channel? We've got lights approximately half a click from landmark Cedar, multiple teams converging." Flashlight beams cut through the forest, accompanied by shouts. The thing retreated into the shadows, its form dissolving like smoke. But before it vanished entirely, David heard Sarah's voice one more time. "I was never here, David. But you always knew that, didn't you?" Then it was gone, and there were only the flashlights, the voices of his colleagues, the solid reality of Hannah Reeves breathing shallow but steady in his arms. They found him sitting with his back against landmark cedar, Hannah's head in his lap, 3 teams of rangers surrounding them with enough lights to turn the clearing into daylight. Anderson knelt beside him, pressed a hand to his shoulder. "Jesus, Mercer. We've been calling for 20 minutes. What happened?" David looked up at him. "Found her in the tree hollow, hypothermic, maybe drugged. Needs immediate evac. We've got a stretcher coming. Can you walk?" "Yeah." But he didn't move. He sat there as the EMTs arrived, as they checked Hannah's vitals and loaded her onto the stretcher, as they administered oxygen and warming packs. He sat there as Anderson gave orders and coordinated the evac route. He sat there as the teams began filing out, their lights bobbing through the forest like fireflies. Finally, Anderson crouched in front of him. "David, the hollow. There were bones." "I saw. Forensics is on the way, but they're old. Years old. Maybe decades." Anderson paused. "They'll need to be identified. Could be multiple victims. Could be Sarah." David finished. He pushed himself to his feet, every muscle protesting. "I know." They walked back together in silence, following the marked trail that the teams had flagged. Around them, the forest seemed different now, still vast, still wild, but no longer hostile. Just trees, just undergrowth, just the endless patient cycle of growth and decay. When they reached base camp, Hannah Reeves was already loaded in the helicopter, its rotors whirring. Her mother stood beside it, crying, pressing her hands against the window. She saw David and broke away, ran to him, threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." David patted her back awkwardly. "She's strong. She'll make it." The paramedic said she kept saying things, kept talking about voices. The mother pulled back, her face streaked with tears and hope. "Did you hear them too?" David looked at her for a long moment. Then he lied. "No. Just her. I heard her calling for help." The mother nodded, accepting this, needing this. She climbed into the helicopter and it lifted off, lights blinking red against the darkness, carrying Hannah away to safety and warmth and eventual recovery. Anderson appeared at David's elbow. "You should get checked out too. Possible hypothermia, definitely exhaustion." "I'm fine." "David, I'm fine." He turned to face his supervisor. "But I need to be here when they excavate the hollow. When they identify the remains." Anderson studied him in the generator lights, understanding crossing his face. "Sarah? Maybe. And if it's not her?" David didn't answer, because the truth was he'd known for 8 years that Sarah was dead. Had known it the moment she disappeared, the moment he'd found her backpack sitting neat and undisturbed beside the trail, just like Hannah's had been. Had known it in the way the forest felt wrong that day, in the voices he'd heard calling his name, in the cold that wasn't quite cold. He'd known, and he'd pushed the knowledge down, buried it under protocols and search patterns and the comfortable lie of rational explanations. Because acknowledging what was really out there, what lived in the deep places, what fed on the lost and the lonely, what wore the faces of the dead, meant acknowledging that some people couldn't be saved, that some cases couldn't be closed, that sometimes the forest simply took what it wanted and gave nothing back. But Hannah had come back. That was something. That was enough. "Get some rest," Anderson said finally. "That's an order." David nodded, but as he walked to his truck, as he drove the winding road back toward civilization, as the forest fell away behind him, he couldn't stop seeing that hollow in the cedar's heart. Couldn't stop counting the bones. Couldn't stop hearing all those voices, calling out in the darkness, perfectly mimicked, fundamentally wrong, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where the voices still echoed, he heard Sarah one more time. "Thank you for finding her, David." even if you couldn't find me." 3 weeks later, DNA analysis confirmed that one of the skeletal remains recovered from Landmark Cedar belonged to Sarah Chen, missing since October 2006. The other bones were still being processed. Early estimates suggested at least 7 other individuals, dating back as far as the 1970s. Hannah Reeves made a full recovery. She never spoke publicly about what happened in the forest, though she told her therapist she couldn't remember anything after leaving the trail. The last thing she recalled was her mother's voice, calling her deeper into the trees. David Mercer continued working as a ranger at Olympic National Park. He requested permanent assignment to the Hoh River Trail sector and spent his days maintaining the paths, marking the safe routes, warning hikers about the dangers of wandering off trail. On quiet mornings, when the mist hung heavy between the trees and the forest held its breath, he sometimes heard voices calling his name. But he'd learned to distinguish between what was real and what was not, between the living and the echoes they left behind. And every time he walked past Landmark Cedar, he paused for just a moment listening, just in case someone was actually calling for help. Thank you for reading all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What's your interpretation of what really happened at Landmark Cedar? Was it truly supernatural, or had David's trauma manifested into something more? I'd be fascinated to read your theories. Mason Garrett had been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 11 years, but he'd never led a school group this deep into the Hoh rainforest. The 5th graders from Port Angeles Elementary moved in an uneven line behind him, their voices bright against the cathedral silence of the old-growth canopy. It was April 23, 2008, and the moss hung so thick from the Sitka spruces that the forest felt upholstered, muffling everything except the distant rush of the Hoh River. "Mr. Garrett, is it true trees here can be 1,000 years old?" A girl with red braids, Emma something, walked beside him, notebook open despite the mist. "Older," Mason said, checking his watch. 2:47 p.m. They'd been on the trail for 90 minutes, and his daughter Lily's soccer game started at 6. He'd promised to be there. Some of these cedars were saplings when Vikings landed in North America. His radio crackled. He recognized the voice of Tom Brewster, the volunteer coordinator back at the visitor center. "Ranger Garrett, we've got weather moving in faster than forecasted, fronts pushing hard from the Pacific." Mason glanced up. The canopy was so dense he couldn't see the sky, but the air had that compressed quality that came before storms in the rainforest, pressure building like water behind a dam. "Copy that. We're at mile marker 4 on the Hoh River Trail, turning back now." "Mr. Davis?" One of the kids, Brandon, the class clown who'd been pretending to be eaten by banana slugs, pointed ahead. "Can we see the big tree? The one on the map?" Their teacher, Mr. Davis, a young man who'd spent most of the hike looking nervously at the GPS unit Mason had lent him, nodded. "It's just another 100 yards, right, Ranger Garrett?" Mason hesitated. The big tree was a massive Sitka spruce that had been used as a trail marker for decades, its base hollowed by fire centuries ago. The kids would love it, and it would only add 10 minutes to the hike. Lily's game didn't start until 6. "All right," he said. "But we move quick. Single file, stay on the trail." The group pressed forward, and Mason counted heads automatically. 23 kids, Mr. Davis, and parent volunteer Mrs. Chen. Everyone accounted for. The trail narrowed, forcing them into a tighter line. On both sides, sword ferns grew waist-high, their fronds beaded with moisture. Something about the density of the undergrowth bothered him. Too thick, making it impossible to see more than a few feet into the forest. They rounded a bend, and there it was, the spruce, its trunk wider than a minivan, bark rippled like frozen water. The hollow at its base was large enough for 3 adults to stand in. The kids broke formation, crowding around it with their phones out. In 2008, the phones were simple. Flip models mostly, with cameras that barely worked in this light. 2 minutes, Mason called. Pictures and back to the trail. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the tree line. The forest had gone quiet in that way that made his scalp prickle. No birds, no rustle of squirrels, just the distant white noise of the river and the soft pad of rain beginning to fall on the canopy above. His radio crackled again. "Mason, this is Tom. That front's accelerating. You need to double time it." "On our way." Mason turned to Mr. Davis. "Time to move." "All right, everyone, back in line. Harper, get out of there." Mason's head snapped around. A girl had climbed into the hollow of the tree, her small frame disappearing into the shadow. He could see her sneakers, her pink jacket visible in the darkness. "Harper Montgomery, right now!" Mr. Davis's voice had an edge Mason recognized, the tone of a teacher who'd been ignored one too many times. The girl emerged, grinning, her blonde hair damp from the mist. She couldn't have been more than 12, Lily's age, with the same gap between her front teeth. Something about her made Mason's chest tighten. His daughter had begged to come on this trip, but he'd said no because he was working it. "Line up." Mason's voice carried the authority of someone used to managing crowds. The kids fell into formation, still chattering about the tree. They started back down the trail. Mason took the lead, setting a pace just short of a jog. The rain intensified, finding gaps in the canopy, splattering on his uniform jacket. Behind him, he could hear Mr. Davis doing a count. 18, 19, 20. "Mr. Garrett, hold up." Mason stopped, turning. The line had compressed, kids bunching up behind Mr. Davis, who stood motionless on the trail, his face pale. "What is it?" "I'm missing someone. I keep counting 23, but..." Mr. Davis's hand shook as he pointed at his roster. "Harper Montgomery. She was right behind me." Mason's training kicked in before the fear could. "Everyone stop. Stay in place." He moved down the line, counting himself. 24 people, minus Mr. Davis, minus Mrs. Chen, 22 kids. Harper was gone. "When did you last see her?" Mason kept his voice level. "She was..." Mr. Davis turned in a circle. "She was right behind me. I saw her pink jacket, right there." Mason looked at the trail behind them. Rain had turned the packed earth dark, but he could see their footprints clearly in the mud. He counted back. The prints ended about 30 feet behind the group, where the trail bent around a massive hemlock. He walked back to the spot, crouching. There. A smaller set of prints. The tread of a child's sneaker, moving off the trail into the ferns. "Harper!" His voice echoed through the trees. "Harper Montgomery, if you can hear me, call out." Nothing. Just rain and river. Mason pulled out his radio. "Visitor Center, this is Ranger Garrett. I have a missing child on the Ho River Trail, approximately 4.2 miles in. Female, 12 years old, blonde hair, pink jacket. Initiating immediate search. Request backup and notify SAR." Tom's voice came back immediately. Professional. "Copy that. SR team is assembling. ETA 45 minutes. Give me a description and last known position." Mason provided the details while scanning the forest. The ferns where the footprints led were crushed, showing a clear path into the undergrowth, but it disappeared after about 10 feet, where the ground turned to moss-covered nurse logs. "Mr. Davis, take the group back to the trailhead. Move fast, but stay together. Mrs. Chen, you take up the rear, count off every 5 minutes." "We should help search," Mr. Davis said, but his voice wavered. "The best help is getting these kids safe. Go. Now." They left. The kids silent now, scared by the sudden shift in tone. Mason waited until they rounded the bend before turning to the forest. His training said to wait for backup. His gut said every second mattered. The temperature had dropped. He could see his breath now, which was strange for April in the rainforest. He followed the crushed ferns, calling Harper's name. The undergrowth was thick, slowing him down. His radio crackled with updates he only half heard. The rain fell harder, drumming on the broad leaves around him. Then he heard it. "Help." A girl's voice, thin and distant, coming from deeper in the forest. Mason's heart lurched. "Harper, keep talking. Follow my voice." "I'm lost. I can't find the trail." He pushed through a thicket of salal, branches scratching his face. "Keep talking, Harper, I'm coming to you." "I'm scared, it's so dark." "I know, honey, but I'm right here. Just keep..." He broke into a clearing. A nurse log, maybe 40 feet long, had fallen years ago, creating an open space beneath the canopy. The ground was carpeted with moss, luminous green even in the dim light. But Harper wasn't there. Harper. No answer. Mason turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The rain had stopped, he realized. When had that happened? The forest was silent again, that unnatural quiet that made him think of held breath. "Harper Montgomery, call out if you can hear me." "I'm here." The voice came from behind him. Mason spun. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a small figure in a pink jacket. But something was wrong. The girl stood perfectly still, her face obscured by shadow despite there being no sun to cast it. "Harper?" Mason took a step forward. "Are you hurt?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Mason's radio crackled. He grabbed it. "Tom, I've got eyes on her. Grid reference." He looked down at his GPS unit, but the screen showed nothing but static. When he looked up, the girl was gone. "Harper!" Mason ran to where she'd been standing, but there were no footprints in the moss. No sign anyone had been there at all. His pulse hammered in his ears. 11 years in these woods, and he'd never felt this kind of wrong. His phone buzzed. Mason pulled it out, one bar of service flickering. A text from his wife, Sarah. "Lily says good luck to Harper's group. See you at the game." The screen flickered and died. The battery icon had showed 70% when he'd checked it an hour ago. "Help me." The voice again, but this time it came from his left, deeper in the forest. Mason moved toward it, his hand instinctively going to the canister of bear spray on his belt. Not that bear spray would help with whatever this was. "I'm coming, Harper. Keep talking." "It's cold. I can't feel my hands." That detail, specific, frightened, convinced him it was real. He crashed through the undergrowth following the voice. His mind was already running through hypothermia protocols. April in Olympic was mild, but shock could lower body temperature fast. He had an emergency blanket in his pack. "Almost there, honey. Just a little..." He stopped. In front of him, not 30 feet away, Harper stood at the base of a cedar tree. This time he could see her face clearly. But it was wrong. Her expression was blank, eyes focused on something beyond him, and she wasn't shivering. If she was cold enough to lose feeling in her hands, she should be shivering. "Harper, can you hear me?" Mason approached slowly, the way he would approach an injured animal. "I'm Ranger Garrett. I'm here to help you." The girl's head tilted, the movement too smooth, too precise. When she spoke, her voice had a layered quality, like multiple people speaking slightly out of sync. "Mason?" He stopped. "How do you know my name?" "Lily's father." The forest tilted. He'd never told these kids about his daughter. He'd mentioned her to Mr. Davis in the parking lot, but Harper had been nowhere near that conversation. "Come here, Harper. Let's get you back to the trail." "I'm not on the trail." Her voice was flat. "I'm in the tree." "What?" "The big tree. I went in and I couldn't come back out. But I can see you from here. You're far away." Mason's hands shook as he pulled out his radio. "Tom, I need you to send someone to that big spruce at mile marker 4.2. Have them check inside the hollow." Static. "Tom, do you copy?" Nothing but white noise. When he looked up, Harper was closer. She'd moved without him seeing, now only 10 feet away. Her eyes were completely black, pupils blown so wide there was no iris visible. "That's not Harper," Mason said out loud, his voice steadier than he felt. "No," the thing wearing Harper's face agreed. "But she's close. She's listening. She wants her mom." Mason's training, 11 years of wilderness protocols and emergency response, offered nothing for this. But something older did. The instinct that had kept humans alive in dark forests for millennia. Run. He turned and crashed back through the undergrowth, not bothering with the path. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Not running, walking. Steady, patient steps that somehow kept pace with his desperate sprint. "Mason." The voice was closer than it should be. "Lily's waiting for you." He didn't look back. A fallen log blocked his path. He vaulted it, landing hard on the other side. His ankle twisted but held. "Keep moving. Get back to the trail. Get help. You promised her." 6 o'clock game. Coach Bennett's team. How did it know that? How did it? Mason burst through a wall of salal and stumbled onto the trail. He recognized this spot, the bench carved from a cedar stump, the interpretive sign about nurse logs. He was half a mile from the big tree, but heading the wrong direction, deeper into the forest. His radio crackled. This time the voice was clear. "Et, do you copy? Mason?" "Tom." Mason grabbed the radio. "I need backup at mile marker 5. I don't have the girl, but there's something." "Mason, SAR is at the big tree. They found her." The world stopped. "What?" "Harper Montgomery. She's alive. Disoriented but alive. She was inside the hollow of that spruce. Says she couldn't find her way out, kept seeing the forest but couldn't reach it. Medics are checking her now." Mason looked back at the forest behind him. Nothing moved in the ferns. No pink jacket. No figure with black eyes. "Mason, where are you?" He looked at the trail marker. Mile 5.3. He'd run the wrong way. I'm coming back. Give me 20 minutes." The hike back should have been straightforward. Mason knew these trails better than his own neighborhood. But twice he found himself at the same fallen cedar, even though he'd only passed it once. The third time he checked his watch, it read 2:47 p.m., the same time they'd left for the big tree. He stopped walking. His hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from something else. How long had he been searching? It felt like hours, but if his watch was right. "Mason, you're going in circles." He spun. There, sitting on a nurse log 20 feet from the trail, was Harper. The real Harper this time. He could tell by her eyes, brown and terrified, and the way she hugged herself against the cold. "Harper." He took a careful step toward her. "Are you hurt?" "I don't know where I am." Her voice cracked. "I tried to follow you, but the forest kept changing. And there's something else here. Something that sounds like my mom." Mason's radio squawked. Tom's voice. "Mason, Harper is secure. We're heading back to the visitor center. Where are you?" Mason and the girl on the log stared at each other. "Harper," Mason said slowly. "What's your mom's name?" Jennifer Montgomery." Into the radio. "Tom, what's Harper's mother's name?" A pause. "Jennifer." "Why?" "Mason, what's going on?" The girl on the log started crying, real tears running down her face. "Please, I just want to go home. My mom's going to be so worried." Mason had to choose. Either the girl the SAR team had was the real Harper, or this one was. One was a child who needed his help. One was something else. His phone buzzed, one bar of service flickering in and out. A voicemail from Sarah, time-stamped 20 minutes ago. "Mason, call me. Lily's asking about the missing girl. It's all over the news. They said they found her, but Lily's crying, saying something's wrong. She says Harper called her phone, but it wasn't Harper's voice. The message cut off. Mason looked at the girl. She'd stopped crying and her face had gone blank again. Waiting. "How do you know my daughter?" Mason asked. "I don't." "You just said her name." "No, I didn't." But she had. Mason was sure of it. Or had she? The memory felt slippery, like trying to hold water. His radio. "Mason, we need you at the trailhead. Harper's parents are here." The girl stood up from the log. In the fading light, her shadow stretched wrong. Too long, too sharp, extending toward him like a reaching hand. "I want my mom," she said, and her voice fractured into that layered quality again. "I want my mom. I want my mom." I want... Mason ran. This time he didn't stop until he burst out of the tree line into the parking lot. The SAR truck was there, lights flashing. Tom ran toward him. Jesus, Mason, we've been calling you for 30 minutes. You okay? Harper. Mason bent over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. The girl you found. Where is she? In the ambulance. Parents are with her. She's going to be fine. Little hypothermic, but... Mason ran to the ambulance. Through the open doors, he could see a girl wrapped in blankets. A woman hugging her. Jennifer Montgomery, probably. The girl looked up as he approached. Brown eyes. Gap between her teeth. She looked exhausted, but alive. Mr. Garrett, she said, and her voice was thin but steady. I'm sorry I went into that tree. I heard my mom calling me, and I thought she was in there, and then I couldn't get out. I could see the forest through the opening, but every time I tried to walk out, I just went deeper in. It's okay, Mason said, but he was studying her face, looking for something he couldn't name. You're safe now. There was something else in there with me, Harper whispered. It kept trying to make me look at it, but I remembered what my dad always says about animals. Never look directly at a predator, so I kept my eyes on the opening. On the light. Her mother kissed her forehead. You're so smart, baby, so smart. Mason stepped back, letting the medics close the ambulance doors. His phone buzzed. Actually rang this time. Full service returned. Sarah. Mason, thank God. Is it true they found her? Yeah, she's okay. He watched the ambulance pull away. I'm okay. Lily wants to talk to you. His daughter's voice, high and scared. Daddy? Harper called me. But it wasn't her. It knew things about her room, about her stuffed animals, but it talked wrong. Like it was reading words instead of saying them. Daddy, what called me? Mason looked back at the forest. The trail disappeared into shadow, and in that shadow something pink flickered between the trees. Then it was gone. I don't know, baby. But Harper's safe. She's with her parents. Are you sure? Mason thought about the girl in the ambulance, the way she'd said his name with perfect recall, despite never having spoken to him before. The way her eyes had met his with sharp intelligence, not the confusion of a lost child who'd been trapped for hours. He thought about the thing in the forest, the one that knew his daughter's name, that knew about the soccer game and Coach Bennett and the promise he'd made. He thought about how the girl in the ambulance hadn't mentioned seeing him at all, hadn't mentioned his voice calling her name, even though he'd been screaming for her for at least 30 minutes. Yeah, Mason said finally. I'm sure. That night, Mason didn't make it to Lily's game. He stayed at the park until long after dark, filing reports and talking to the county sheriff and trying to explain what he'd seen without sounding insane. He didn't mention the thing wearing Harper's face. He didn't mention how his watch had stopped or how the forest had looped on itself. He just said he'd gotten disoriented during the search and took a wrong turn. Tom drove him home just after midnight. You did good today, Tom said. Kid's alive because you acted fast. Yeah. You sure you're okay? You seem shaken. Mason looked out the window at the dark trees lining Highway 101. That girl, Harper, when SAR found her in the tree, did she say anything? Like what? Like why she climbed in there in the first place? Tom shrugged. Said she heard her mom calling, thought the voice came from inside. Kids, you know? They get confused. But Harper's mother hadn't been in the forest. She'd been at work in Port Angeles, 40 miles away. Mason had confirmed that with the sheriff. So what had Harper heard calling her name? When he got home, Sarah was waiting up. Lily was asleep on the couch, her phone clutched in her hand. Sarah hugged him hard. She wouldn't go to bed until you got home, Sarah whispered. She kept saying Harper called again, but it was just breathing. I checked the phone, the calls are there, but they're from Harper's number. I texted Jennifer Montgomery and she said Harper's been with her all evening. Hasn't touched her phone. Mason looked at his daughter, peaceful in sleep. He thought about taking her phone and deleting the voicemails, but something stopped him. Instead, He went to the kitchen and poured himself a bourbon, his hands still shaking. His own phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Thank you for finding her." Mason stared at it, then typed, "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared, showing someone was typing. Then stopped. Then started again. Finally, "I'm in the tree." Mason's blood turned to ice. "Harper?" "The other one. The one that went in. I'm still here, but I can see out now. I can see everywhere." Mason should have blocked the number. Should have called the sheriff. Instead, he typed, "What are you?" The response came immediately. "Hungry." Then, "Your daughter has a game on Saturday. Court 3, Coach Bennett. I'll be watching." Mason deleted the messages, then blocked the number, then checked every lock in the house twice. But all night, lying in bed next to Sarah, he kept thinking about that pink jacket flickering between the trees, about the girl with black eyes who knew his daughter's name, about Harper Montgomery, safe at home with her parents who maybe wasn't Harper at all. And somewhere deep in the Hoh rainforest, in the hollow of a tree older than nations, something waited. It had learned to mimic voices perfectly now, had learned how to wear a face that would make people trust it, help it, take it home. It had been hungry for so long, but now it knew where the children played. Mason Garrett still works at Olympic National Park. He never leads school groups anymore, and every night he checks his daughter's phone, looking for calls from numbers that shouldn't exist, from voices that know too much. Because he understands now what he found that day in April 2008. Harper Montgomery came home. But something else came with her. And in the Hoh rainforest, when the mist is thick and the trees hold their breath, you can still hear a girl's voice calling for help. Rangers know better than to answer. But sometimes hikers don't. Sometimes they follow the voice. Sometimes they climb into the tree. And sometimes they come back out. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative of parasitic entities and identity horror in the Olympic wilderness, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened to Harper? Did she escape, or did something else walk out of that tree? Share your theories in the comments. The ranger's expression told Benjamin Carter everything he needed to know about how this conversation would go. That mixture of desperate hope and rural superstition. The weathered face lined with too many sleepless nights, spent believing in things that didn't exist. Ben had seen it 100 times before. In the Amazon, in the Carpathians, in the Australian outback. People clinging to their myths when faced with the uncomfortable randomness of tragedy. Dr. Carter, thank you for coming so quickly. Ranger Thomas Whitmore extended a calloused hand across the cluttered desk of the North Cascades National Park Ranger Station. Outside the window, October fog rolled through the valley like something alive, obscuring the jagged peaks in sheets of gray. I know you and Sophia were colleagues. I'm sorry about the circumstances. Ben shook the hand briefly, noting the small bone charm hanging from Whitmore's neck. Tourist trap stuff, probably picked up from one of the reservation gift shops. Sophia Mitchell was my research partner for 3 years, he said, settling into the wooden chair that creaked under his weight. Before she decided to throw away her career chasing fairy tales in the woods. Whitmore's jaw tightened. She was investigating something important. She was investigating nothing, Ben corrected, pulling out his phone out of habit before remembering the complete lack of signal he'd encountered the moment he'd turned onto the mountain road. 2009, and they still couldn't get decent coverage in these remote areas. Sophia got caught up in the same romantic nonsense that derails half the anthropologists who spend too long in the field, going native, as they say. It's a professional hazard. The Salish elders warned her not to go up to Cascade Pass after dark, Whitmore said quietly, his fingers unconsciously touching the bone charm. She went anyway. That was 8 days ago. We found her camp 3 days ago, and Dr. Carter... He paused, seeming to struggle with something. I've been a ranger for 23 years. I've seen bear attacks, falls, hypothermia victims. What we found at that camp, it wasn't any of those things. Ben suppressed a sigh. He'd driven 7 hours from Seattle expecting to find evidence of a hiking accident, maybe a fall, possibly even suicide. Sophia had been increasingly erratic in her final emails, rambling about boundary violations and awakened guardians. Classic symptoms of a breakdown. Instead, he was getting ghost stories. "Show me the camp," he said flatly. "And please, spare me the local legends. I'm here to find out what actually happened to my colleague, not to collect folklore." The drive up the mountain took 40 minutes on a deteriorating fire road. Whitmore's truck grinding through switchbacks while mist condensed on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. The ranger kept glancing at Ben as if wanting to say something, then thinking better of it. Finally, as they climbed above the tree line into an alpine meadow studded with stunted pines, he spoke. "The Salish people have lived in these mountains for over 10,000 years, Whitmore said. "That's not superstition. That's longer than written history. They have rules about certain places, certain times. Rules that kept them alive all that time. Rules based on pre-scientific understanding of natural phenomena," Ben replied, watching the fog swirl between the trees like something seeking. "I've published 2 papers on the sociological function of taboos in indigenous cultures. Their social control mechanisms, Ranger Whitmore. Ways to keep people away from dangerous areas by wrapping geographic hazards in supernatural packaging. The cursed stream is actually contaminated with heavy metals. The haunted cave has toxic gas seepage. There's always a rational explanation." "Is there?" It wasn't a question. Whitmore pulled the truck to a stop in a small clearing. "Camp's about half a mile up that trail. I'm required to warn you that Salish tradition holds this entire area as sacred ground. Specifically, it's tied to the Tizikomi, the cannibal spirits that hunger in winter, and the Sisiutl, the serpent spirits that guard the boundary between this world and the spirit world." Sophia's notes indicated she was investigating reports of unusual behavior from hikers in this area. People coming back changed, not remembering parts of their trips, some never coming back at all. Ben grabbed his pack from the truck bed, noting with professional disdain that it was already late afternoon. They'd have maybe 3 hours of usable light less in this fog. "Ranger, with all due respect, if you're about to tell me Sophia was eaten by a mythological creature, I'm going to have serious concerns about the competency of this investigation." Whitmore's face hardened. "I'm telling you what the evidence shows, and what it shows doesn't make any goddamn sense." The trail wound through increasingly dense forest, Douglas firs rising like cathedral pillars into the mist. Ben had to admit, grudgingly, that the atmosphere was oppressive. The kind of place that would naturally generate folklore. No bird sounds, no insects. Just the soft crunch of their boots on the needle-strewn path, and the distant whisper of wind through branches that sounded almost like voices if you were predisposed to hear them, which Ben wasn't. He'd spent his career, a very successful career, thank you, debunking exactly this kind of thinking. His first book, Rational Spirits, Scientific Explanations for Global Ghost Phenomena, had been a bestseller in academic circles. His second, The Folklore Trap, How Superstition Undermines Indigenous Studies, had earned him a reputation as the field's foremost skeptic. Sophia had co-authored 3 chapters before their falling out, back when she still believed in evidence over intuition. That had been before her trip to the Kino Reservation last spring, before she'd come back talking about violations and boundaries and debts that must be paid, before she'd walked away from their research, their grant money, their paper on the neurocognitive basis of spirit belief, before she'd betrayed everything they'd built together for the sake of chasing phantoms in the fog. The camp appeared suddenly through the mist, and Ben felt his scholarly confidence flicker for just a moment before reasserting itself. Sophia's tent remained standing, though the fabric flapped in the wind through long tiers that looked almost deliberate. Her equipment was scattered in a rough circle around the campsite. Sleeping bag, cooking gear, camera, notebooks. But the arrangement was too precise to be the result of animal scavenging or weather. It looked ritualistic, staged. "Don't touch anything yet," Whitmore said quietly. "Just look first." Ben stepped carefully into the clearing, his anthropologist's eye automatically cataloging details. The campfire had been extinguished by something other than water or dirt. The logs were cracked and splintered, as if frozen and shattered. Sophia's notebooks lay open to pages covered in her handwriting, increasingly frantic, increasingly illegible. He knelt beside them, reading fragments. The boundary markers were destroyed. They said it would happen. I didn't listen. Something following me since the fourth night. I can hear it breathing when the wind stops. It's not one thing. It's many things. They're cooperating. That's not supposed to be possible. If you find this, Ben, I'm sorry. I should have listened. You should listen. Get out of the mountains. Ben stood abruptly, willing his heart to stop racing. Hypothermia could cause paranoia, sleep deprivation, dehydration, any number of rational explanations for increasingly disturbed journal entries. He moved to examine the tent. The tears in the fabric weren't tears at all, he realized with growing unease. They were too clean, too precise, like cuts, like something with very sharp implements had sliced through the reinforced nylon in measured strokes. The sleeping bag inside had been pulled out and opened, the down filling scattered across the tent floor in patterns that looked almost like symbols. Ben pulled out his camera, old school digital since his phone was useless up here, and began documenting. That's when he saw the trees. Every tree around the clearing, for about 30 feet in every direction, had been marked. Not with carved symbols or paint. The bark had been stripped away in vertical lines, exposing the pale wood beneath. The pattern repeated on every trunk, visible even through the mist. Ben felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. Vandalism. Had to be. Except Sophia had been alone up here, and the trees showed signs of weathering, meaning the marks were at least several days old. Meaning they'd been here before she disappeared. The Salish mark sacred boundaries, Whitmore said from behind him. These trees are warnings. This entire clearing is supposed to be off limits, especially during the season between autumn and winter, when the Tsukomi are strongest. Sophia knew that. Her notes indicate she came here specifically because of that. She was trying to document what she called genuine supernatural manifestation. There's no such thing, Ben said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He moved to the far edge of the clearing where Sophia's camera bag lay on its side, contents spilled into the pine needles. Her expensive Nikon was cracked, the lens shattered from inside as if by tremendous pressure. Her backup camera was gone. But the memory cards? He picked up the small plastic case, found 3 cards inside. His hands, he noticed with annoyance, were shaking slightly. The temperature had dropped significantly since they'd arrived, his breath now visible in small clouds. That was normal for October at this elevation. Normal. We need to get these developed, he said. There's a rational explanation for all of this. There has to be. The ranger station has a card reader and computer, Whitmore offered. We can look at them there. But Dr. Carter, maybe we should head back now. Light's fading fast, and I don't like being up here after dark. I especially don't like being here during the time of between seasons. The elders say that's when the veil is thinnest. The veil? Ben repeated dryly, some of his skepticism returning. Right. Let me just collect a few more samples and we can... The sound cut through the forest like a knife through fabric. Not an animal sound, not wind, something else. Something that started low and rose in pitch until it seemed to resonate in Ben's chest cavity, making his ribs ache. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that Ben realized he'd been hearing a faint background hum of forest noise without knowing it until it was gone. What the hell was that? His voice came out more shaken than he intended. Whitmore's face had gone pale. That's what the hikers reported. The ones who came back. They said they heard sounds that didn't belong to anything alive. Sounds that made them feel like they were being pulled apart from inside. He touched his bone charm again. We need to leave. Now. Ben wanted to argue, wanted to maintain his rational stance. But something primitive in his brain was screaming at him to run. He shoved the memory cards into his jacket pocket and started gathering Sophia's notebooks. As he bent to grab the last one, he saw something that made him freeze. Footprints in the soft earth beside the tent. Human-sized but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too deep, and they seemed to have more than 5 toes. They led from the tent into the forest, and where they passed, the pine needles had turned black, as if scorched. "Dr. Carter," Whitmore's voice was tight. "We need to go right now, please." The sound came again, closer this time, and with it came a smell that made Ben's eyes water. Like rot and copper and something acrid, chemical. He grabbed the rest of the notebooks and ran, Whitmore already ahead of him on the trail. The fog had thickened impossibly, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet. Ben stumbled over roots, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his rational mind trying desperately to categorize what he'd just experienced while his animal hindbrain focused entirely on escape. They burst out of the forest and into the clearing where the truck was parked. Whitmore had the engine running before Ben even had the door closed, and they were barreling down the fire road in the growing darkness, the headlights barely penetrating the fog that seemed to follow them like something hunting. Neither man spoke during the drive down the mountain. Ben clutched Sophia's notebooks to his chest, feeling the rapid beating of his heart slowly return to normal. There was an explanation. There had to be. Mass hysteria. Infrasound from geological activity causing hallucinations. Misidentification of natural phenomena. His mind cycled through possibilities, rejecting the one that kept trying to surface. That Sophia had been right. That there were things in these mountains that didn't fit into his carefully constructed rational universe. Back at the ranger station, Whitmore made coffee with shaking hands, while Ben set up the card reader. The first memory card was corrupted, the files unreadable. The second showed normal photos, Sophia's documentation of her hike, landscape shots, the camp being set up. Then the images started to change. Frame after frame of the forest at night, shot with a flash that illuminated maybe 20 feet of trees and fog. Nothing unusual at first glance. But when Ben zoomed in, he saw them. Figures. Multiple figures, standing just at the edge of the light, their outlines wrong in ways he couldn't immediately identify. Too tall, too angular. In one photo he could make out what might have been a face, if faces could have mouths that opened vertically instead of horizontally, revealing darkness that seemed to extend impossibly far back. "Jesus Christ," Whitmore whispered, looking over his shoulder. The third card was worse. The photos were time-stamped to the night before Sophia disappeared. They showed the inside of her tent, the camera apparently set to take photos at 30-second intervals. The first dozen were unremarkable, Sophia in her sleeping bag reading by flashlight. Then in frame 13 there was a shadow visible through the tent wall, a large shadow, with too many limbs. Frame 14, the tent was opening. Frame 15, something was inside. Ben couldn't look at frame 15 for more than a second before his eyes began to water and his head started to pound. The shape in the photo refused to resolve properly, his brain unable to process the geometry of it. It was like looking at an optical illusion designed by something that didn't understand human perception. Frame 16, Sophia was gone. The sleeping bag lay empty. The tent flap hung open. There were no more photos after that. Ben stood up abruptly, his chair clattering backward. This is doctored. This has to be doctored. Sophia was having a breakdown. She could have manipulated these images to support her delusions. She's been missing for 8 days, Whitmore interrupted. And I have 17 reports from hikers over the past 6 months describing the same things. The sounds, the figures at the edge of firelight, the feeling of being watched by something that isn't quite there until suddenly it is. 2 other people have disappeared in this area since June. This isn't delusion, Dr. Carter. This is pattern. Patterns can be coincidence, not patterns like this. Ben grabbed Sophia's most recent notebook, flipping through it desperately, looking for something, anything, that would provide a rational framework. His eyes caught on a passage dated 2 days before she disappeared. I found the destroyed boundary markers today. Someone, probably ignorant hikers, knocked down 3 of the carved warning poles that the Quinault people maintained. The elders were right to be concerned. The violations have consequences. The Tsukomi don't forgive trespass. The Sisiutl don't forget debts. I've been researching the traditional appeasement rituals, but I don't think there's enough time. They're already here. I can feel them circling the camp at night. They whisper in a language that makes my teeth ache. Ben was wrong. I was wrong to listen to him for so long. Some things can't be explained away. Some things are exactly what they appear to be. Hungry, ancient, and utterly indifferent to whether we believe in them or not. The lights in the ranger station flickered. Once. Twice. The coffee pot made a sound like grinding metal and went dark. Whitmore's computer screen showed static for a moment before the whole system shut down. "Generator must be acting up," Whitmore said, but his hand went to his bone charm again. "I'll check the backup." The sound hit them both like a physical force. The same rising wail they'd heard at the camp, but louder, closer, coming from multiple directions at once. The windows rattled in their frames. Ben's ears popped. He tasted copper. "They followed us," Whitmore said, his voice barely audible over the sound. "Oh God, they followed us down the mountain. That's never happened before. They never come this close to..." The window shattered inward, spraying glass across the station floor. Something dark and many-limbed flowed through the opening like liquid shadow taking solid form. Ben's mind refused to process it properly. His vision kept sliding off it, unable to focus, unable to categorize. He saw too many joints, too many angles, heard breathing that came from multiple sources that didn't align with anything resembling a mouth. Whitmore was screaming something in what sounded like Salish, holding his bone charm out like a shield. The thing, the Tsukomi, the ancient cannibal spirit, the thing that couldn't possibly exist, turned its attention to the ranger. Ben saw movement, saw Whitmore lifted off the ground by appendages that hurt to look at directly, saw the ranger's body go rigid as the color drained from his face, from his hands, from every visible inch of skin until he looked like a freeze-dried corpse. Then the thing dropped him and turned toward Ben. He ran. Rational thought evaporated, replaced by pure survival instinct. Out the back door, into the parking lot, into his car. His hands fumbled with the keys. The engine wouldn't turn over. The thing was at the station door now, pulling itself through in ways that violated basic physics. Ben saw it properly for the first time. Humanoid but stretched, elongated, its skin like tree bark, its mouth opening vertically to reveal rings and rings of teeth descending into impossible darkness. There were more of them behind it. 3, 4, maybe more. And between them, something larger moved. Something serpentine, something with multiple heads that wove through the air like smoke made solid. The Sisiutl, the boundary guardian, the spirit serpent that wasn't supposed to exist. His car roared to life on the 5th try. Ben threw it into reverse, not caring that he was fishtailing on the gravel, not caring about anything except distance. The things pursued for maybe 100 yards, keeping pace with his car impossibly, then stopped at the edge of the ranger station property, as if hitting an invisible wall. He could see them in his rearview mirror, silhouetted against the station lights, watching him go, letting him go. He drove through the night, breaking every speed limit, his mind trying and failing to process what he'd seen. When he finally hit an area with cell coverage somewhere south of Marble Mount, his phone lit up with messages, missed calls, his university, the police, the park service. He pulled over at a gas station, hands still shaking, and called his department chair. "Ben? Jesus, where have you been? We've been trying to reach you for hours. It's about Sophia Mitchell." "I know," Ben said, his voice hoarse. "I was at the search site. They found her," his chair interrupted. "About 2 hours ago. She walked out of the woods on her own down near the Skagit River. She's alive, Ben. She's in the hospital in Cedro Woolley. She's not doing great. Severe malnutrition, exposure, some kind of traumatic shock. But she's alive." Ben ended the call, his mind reeling. She was alive. She'd survived. 8 days in the mountains with those things, and she'd survived. He drove to the hospital in a daze, arriving just after midnight. The nurse at the desk directed him to a private room where Sophia lay in a hospital bed, hooked to IVs, her skin pale as parchment, her hair matted and full of pine needles. But her eyes were open, and when she saw him, she smiled. A terrible smile. "You saw them," she whispered. "You finally saw them. Sophia, what happened up there? What were those things? There has to be an explanation, a rational—" "I paid the debt," she interrupted softly. "When they came for me, I offered them something else, something they wanted more than my flesh. I told them about you, Ben, about the man who spent his entire career denying they existed, about the anthropologist who wrote papers calling their people's sacred traditions cognitive failures. They were very interested in you. They said a skeptic's terror tastes sweeter than ordinary fear." Ben felt ice spread through his veins. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I bought my life with yours. I led them down the mountain. I showed them where you'd be. The Tsukomi are patient, Ben. They can wait, they can follow. And the Sisiutl—" She laughed, a dry, crackling sound. "The Sisiutl mark their prey. You've been marked. You'll see the signs. In mirrors. In reflections. In the shadows that move when they shouldn't. They'll let you run. They'll let you hide. But boundaries are boundaries and debts are debts, and you crossed so many lines without even knowing they were there." "You're delusional," Ben said desperately. "The trauma, the exposure, it's made you—" "Look at your hand," Sophia whispered. Ben looked down, his right hand, the one that had picked up the memory cards in Sophia's camp. The skin was darkening, thin black lines spreading from his fingertips up toward his wrist in patterns that looked organic but weren't. They looked like the marks on the trees. They looked like warnings. "It starts slow," Sophia said. "Then it accelerates. You'll feel them getting closer. Every night. Every time you close your eyes. They're very thorough, Ben. Very patient. And very, very hungry. I estimate you have maybe a month before they come for you in earnest. Less if you try to leave the region. They don't like it when their marked prey tries to run beyond the boundary." Ben backed toward the door, his marked hand throbbing with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "That's what makes it so perfect," Sophia said, closing her eyes. "You'll spend your last weeks trying to find a rational explanation, trying to disprove the impossible. And every night, you'll hear them getting closer. Every night you'll know that everything you built your career on was wrong. That's the real terror, isn't it, Dr. Carter? Not the dying, the knowing." Ben ran. Out of the hospital, into his car, down the highway toward Seattle. The marks on his hand were spreading. In the rearview mirror, between glances at the road, he thought he saw something serpentine keeping pace with his car. Something with multiple heads. Something that wove through the darkness like it owned it. The radio crackled to static, then resolved into a sound he recognized. That rising wail. That impossible pitch that made his bones ache. And underneath it, barely audible, he heard breathing. Multiple sources. Multiple throats. Coming from the back seat that was definitely, absolutely empty. He drove faster, knowing it wouldn't matter. Knowing that Sophia was right. Knowing that somewhere in the North Cascades a boundary had been crossed and a debt had been marked, and there were things in the ancient forests that were exactly what they appeared to be. Hungry, patient, and utterly indifferent to whether he believed in them or not. The signs were everywhere now. The marks on his hand had reached his elbow. In every window he passed, in every reflection he saw them. The tall figures with too many joints, the serpent with multiple heads, the things that walked in the spaces between this world and whatever lay beyond. They were coming. They had always been coming. And Dr. Benjamin Carter, who had spent his entire career explaining away the impossible, finally understood that some debts couldn't be rationalized, some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, and some things in the dark were exactly as terrifying as the old stories claimed. By the time he reached Seattle, the marks had spread to his shoulder. He could feel them inside him now, moving beneath his skin like something burrowing. In the distance, He heard mountains calling. In the darkness, he heard voices in a language that made his teeth ache. And he knew, with the absolute certainty of the formerly rational now confronted with undeniable truth, that the thing he feared most wasn't death itself, but the knowledge that would accompany it. That he'd been wrong about everything. That the world was so much stranger and more terrible than his books had claimed, and that somewhere in the fog-wrapped mountains, ancient things were laughing at the anthropologist who'd finally learned to believe. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?